The political theory of TV news. Cultural theorist Stuart in the 1970s wanted to explain why TV broadcasting was so unique in the way that it communicated information in comparison to other previous formats. Communication in general was seen as a loop, but a loop with specific connected but independent moments. And this loop provided a product which was effective communication, and like any physical product, it was made with tools and a series of social relations which would facilitate the effective production of communication. Effective communication being communication which ends up affecting audience actions or thoughts. And Hall was particularly interested with one moment in the communication loop, and this was the circulation moment. Particularly, he was interested with its encoding and decoding moments. And to contextualize this a little bit, we can think of a news broadcast which is trying to effectively communicate a certain event that's happened. To actually communicate that physical event, the event has to become a story using language, which can be circulated in discourse. That process requires the encoding of a story with meaning by the broadcaster and the decoding of meaning from the story by the audience for an effective loop of communication. And we know the communication has been effective if the code used aligns between both sides who end up with a similar meaning. But TV, like all formats, has certain limitations, structures, which create rules which TV broadcasters have to abide by to create the effective communication. And it is worth saying that this is a loop, so audience reaction and the kind of surrounding conditions around that broadcast will have feedback and will feed back into the loop of TV's communication. Here then, the TV producers are primarily concerned with the effectiveness of their broadcast communication, not necessarily with the actual accuracy of events being depicted, but of the effective encoding and dominant audience understandings. TV will most likely go to dominant understandings to create meaning with their stories, and the audience will kind of understand these pre-established codes of dominant meaning because they've experienced them time and time again. We have an additional problem here where TV broadcasters are actually implanting a subjective interpretation of events which fit the dominant pre-established ideological understanding into their broadcasts, so that they believe it can be reaching the most people in their specific audience that they picked. So TV being prone to use those dominant codes and meanings will tend to kind of naturalize audiences into almost unconsciously decoding those messages in that pre-established, often used coding. Because as we, an audience, continuously take in that information, we gain this ability to unconsciously decode those messages if they're coded in a very similar way that we've seen many times before. But we kind of also then forget that there's an implicit ideology being sneaked into those messages. And again, television agrees with this process of naturalization because it appears like it's producing these accurate images and this accurate audio of specific events that can be ingested in this kind of habitual, unconscious manner. But to make this a little bit clearer, we can go over three kind of positions that end up being taken within the encoding decoding process. The first is the dominant hegemonic position. This is where the viewer decodes the message in the broadcast in the same way that it was encoded by the broadcaster, meaning that both sides operated within this dominant understanding. For this, we could even look at the coverage after 9/11, where a dominant understanding was put across about why 9/11 happened, what the response needed to be, and where those actions needed to be taken. Secondly, we have the negotiated code or position. This is where the encoding decoding process deviates a little bit, but not completely. You'll find in between the encoding and the decoding between broadcasters and audience, there's going to be some opposition and some adaptations. They're generally accepting the larger dominant meaning being put across, but stuff ends up varying situationally and by each person. It feels like it's difficult to pick one kind of event where this applies, but let's just take like the 2008 crash, where there were stories being put out about it by the media, but it wasn't necessarily easily understood. There's a lot of different people understanding a lot of different things from why it happened and who should blame. Hall uses an example, the coverage on government financial decisions, where a worker might agree on the national interest to reduce spending, but at the same time will go on strike against the reduction in their payment, which would theoretically reduce spending, but at the same time is hitting them situationally in a way they don't agree with. And Hall actually believes this is where most misunderstandings come in this communication process, is between the dominant encoding and this negotiated corporate decoding process. And finally, we have the oppositional code, or position. This is when the dominant encoding by a broadcaster is read, it's understood, but the audience member actually deconstructs the meaning that the broadcaster implanted and reorganizes it through their own code.
Here's an actual customer out here. What's the best kind of firework to buy?
Wouldn't you like to know, weather boy?
And that last one, that oppositional coding or that oppositional position, does feel like we're seeing a lot now, with the internet allowing people to construct their own narratives, construct their own codes, construct their own meaning, which is maybe why TV feels so much less important than it maybe once was for our communication.